The skies over the eastern Mediterranean are no longer just contested. They are the new chessboard where empires either consolidate or crack. Right now, in 2026, Turkey's Air Force sits at the absolute center of that storm, and both NATO and Israel know it. Here's what the mainstream narrative won't tell you. Turkey's President Erdogan has been demanding reinstatement into the F-35 program, arguing it would strengthen NATO security. But Israel holds a quiet veto over that deal, citing its own domestically developed avionics embedded deep inside that aircraft. Think about that. A NATO ally effectively blocked by a non-NATO state from acquiring the alliance's most advanced fighter jet. That's not an alliance. That's a power structure revealing its true architecture. Meanwhile, Ankara isn't sitting still. Turkey has unveiled 3 KN stealth fighter prototypes simultaneously, with first flights scheduled for April through August 2026, positioning itself alongside the United States, Russia, and China as one of the only nations on Earth advancing an indigenous fifth-generation fighter. Turkey does not need anyone's permission to arm itself anymore, and that is precisely the strategic statement Kaan is designed to make. And the battlefield is already active. NATO forces have intercepted Iranian ballistic missiles entering Turkish airspace twice in a single week, as US-Israeli strikes on Iran threw the wider Middle East into open conflict. Turkey's air defense is not hypothetical. It is operational. It is live. It is now. This is the story of who controls the sky and who gets to decide the rules of the game. Let's start where the real story begins. Not in the news headlines, not in the NATO press briefings, but in the cold, hard geometry of power. Turkey sits at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. It controls the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, those narrow straits that decide who moves warships from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean and who doesn't. It hosts Incirlik Air Base, one of the most consequential military installations on the planet, a facility that, right now in 2026, houses approximately 50 American nuclear warheads and serves as a pivotal takeoff point for Western air operations stretching deep into the Middle East. Now stop right there. Let that sink in for a moment. 50 nuclear weapons sitting on Turkish soil. And the man who controls that soil, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, has been publicly calling Benjamin Netanyahu the Hitler of our time, has had an Istanbul court indict Netanyahu for genocide, and has been methodically building a war mobilization framework inside Turkey that most Western analysts are only now beginning to fully understand. This is not a peripheral drama. This is the central geopolitical story of 2026, and most Americans are not paying enough attention to it. Let me take you back to where the fracture began, because you have to understand the architecture of betrayal before you can understand the architecture of rearmament. In 2019, Turkey made a deliberate, calculated decision to purchase the Russian S-400 air defense system. Washington screamed, Brussels muttered, NATO wrung its hands. But Erdogan didn't blink. The United States removed Turkey from the F-35 program, arguing the S-400 deal was incompatible with alliance military equipment and could compromise fifth-generation fighter operations. Think about the consequences of that single decision for a moment. Turkey had paid into the F-35 program. Turkish factories were producing components. Turkish pilots were training. And in one fell swoop, because Ankara dared to assert its own strategic independence and buy Russian air defense technology, the most powerful military alliance in human history expelled its second-largest army from its crown jewel aviation program. Erdogan filed that humiliation away, and he has been building his answer to it ever since. That answer has a name, Kaan. The Thai Kaan is a twin-engine, single-seat stealth fighter designed entirely by Turkish aerospace industries. Turkey's statement to the world that it does not need anyone's permission to arm itself. This isn't just a fighter jet program. This is a civilizational declaration. Turkey has unveiled 3 Kaan stealth fighter prototypes simultaneously, placing itself within the exclusive club of nations advancing indigenous fifth-generation fighters alongside the United States, Russia, and China, with first flights scheduled aggressively between April and August 2026. And here is where it gets genuinely fascinating from a geopolitical standpoint. Early reports suggest that even NATO allies like Spain are considering purchasing the Kaan over the F-35, primarily because of rising tensions in the transatlantic relationship. Read that again. A NATO ally potentially buying Turkish stealth jets instead of American ones. The alliance is no longer a monolith. It is fracturing along lines of interest and dependency, and Turkey's Air Force sits directly at the center of that fracture. But here is where the story of Turkey's air power becomes truly explosive. And I mean that in the most literal sense possible. NATO forces intercepted Iranian ballistic missiles entering Turkish airspace twice in a single week in early March 2026, as US-Israeli strikes on Iran threw the wider Middle East into open conflict. Turkish air defenses were not sitting idle in some theoretical deterrence posture. They were actively shooting down Iranian missiles over Turkish territory, following a ballistic missile launch from Iran reportedly directed toward the vicinity of Incirlik Air Base itself. Turkey's defense ministry announced the deployment of an additional Patriot air defense battery to the base. And then NATO began looking into reinforcing its ballistic missile defense capacity in Turkey further, given the active threat from Iran. So you have this breathtaking situation where the same base that houses American nuclear weapons is being actively targeted by Iranian missiles, is being defended by a layered NATO-Turkish air defense network, and is simultaneously at the center of a geopolitical tug of war between Erdogan and Washington. This is not a Cold War scenario unfolding in slow motion. This is a live wire in real time. Now let's talk about what Turkey's military posture inside NATO actually means at the strategic level, because this is where most commentators miss the forest for the trees. For the first time in NATO's history, Turkey assumed command of NATO's Airborne Troops Command and the NATO Response Forces Airborne Troops Command, a position it holds through June 2026. Simultaneously, Turkey's defense minister Yaşar Güler has been making the case for deeper Turkish integration into Europe's defense architecture, arguing that Ankara offers a large standing military, extensive combat experience, strategic geography bridging Europe and the Middle East, and a defense industrial base capable of rapid production at scale. In other words, Turkey is not sulking on the margins of the alliance. Turkey is positioning itself as the indispensable pivot, the country that NATO literally cannot function without in the eastern arc of its defensive perimeter, and Erdogan knows that leverage intimately. He has weaponized it repeatedly. He has threatened to shut Incirlik down. He controls the Bosphorus. He has the second largest army in NATO. And now, with Kayan in development and Bayraktar drones already reshaping battlefield doctrine from Libya to Ukraine to Nagorno-Karabakh, Turkey's defense industrial sovereignty is no longer aspirational. It is real. This brings us to the other side of this equation, Israel. And this is where the story becomes genuinely combustible. Because what is happening between Turkey and Israel right now is not simply a diplomatic quarrel or a religious political rivalry. It is a structural competition over who shapes the Middle East in the post-Gaza, post-Iran war order. The roots of Ankara's hostility toward Israel go back to 2008, when Erdogan began systematically dismantling what had been a fruitful and trust-based relationship anchored in intelligence sharing, military cooperation, tourism, and trade. That partnership, which once included joint military exercises between Turkish and Israeli air forces, is now so dead that the two countries are actively preparing for the possibility of armed confrontation. Growing evidence suggests the Erdogan government may be steering Turkey toward a potential military confrontation with Israel, possibly in the Syrian theater. And if Erdogan chooses to pursue that military confrontation, there are reportedly few, if any, senior officers left in the Turkish armed forces capable of opposing such a move. The purges after the 2016 coup attempt hollowed out the officer corps of any independent-minded commanders. What remains is an institution loyal to Erdogan personally. That is a dangerous configuration when the man at the top is talking about Israel the way he currently is. And Israel is not sitting still either. Israel appears to be applying to Turkey the same preventive logic it has already employed with other regional actors, working to contain at an early stage what might in the future reduce Israel's freedom of action or challenge its strategic superiority. This is Israel's traditional doctrine of preemptive strategic management, now applied not just to Iran or Hezbollah, but to a NATO member state with the second largest army in the alliance. Think about how extraordinary that is. Israel and a NATO member state are now in a relationship so adversarial that Israeli security analysts are openly discussing the logic of preemptive action. Israel has already signaled it may veto Turkey's potential reinstatement into the F-35 program, citing Israeli-developed avionics and sensors embedded in the aircraft, and expressing security concerns rooted in Ankara's S-400 acquisition and broader policy shifts. This is the quiet power play that most people overlook. Israel does not need to fire a single missile to damage Turkey's Air Force ambitions. It can do it through Washington's procurement bureaucracy, through congressional leverage, through the technical specifications of a fighter jet. That is smart power deployed with precision. Meanwhile, the Eastern Mediterranean has been transformed into a physical chessboard, where air and naval power are being repositioned in real time. Greece, Israel, and Cyprus signed a joint action plan committing to intensified air and naval exercises in the Eastern Mediterranean in 2026, deepening a trilateral defense partnership that has been closely watched and deeply unsettled by Turkey. Athens is simultaneously negotiating purchases of the Israeli Achilles shield system costing approximately 3 billion euros and approved 36 Pulse rocket artillery systems specifically to strengthen its defenses against Turkey. Notice what is happening here. A NATO member, Greece, is buying Israeli weapons to defend against another NATO member, Turkey. The alliance's internal contradictions are no longer theoretical. They are being priced into procurement contracts. Turkish aircraft violated Greek airspace more than 11,000 times in 2022 alone, and while incidents declined after a diplomatic rapprochement beginning in 2023, they never entirely ceased. 11,000 violations in a single year against a fellow NATO ally, and the alliance managed it with press statements and diplomatic corridors rather than any structural response. That tells you everything about how NATO actually functions when member states collide with each other. What is happening in Syria adds yet another combustible layer to this entire story. Turkey has become the new Syrian government's most important military ally, providing arms, intelligence, and technical assistance, while Israel launched extensive airstrikes immediately after Assad's fall, dramatically undermining the arsenal available to that same new government. So Turkey and Israel are now proxy adversaries inside a collapsed state, each backing different factions, each projecting air power for different strategic goals, and each watching the other's moves with the kind of focused attention that precedes escalation. Turkey fears encirclement. Growing military cooperation between Cyprus and Israel and joint military exercises between Greece, Cyprus, and Israel exacerbate Turkish fears of being surrounded by a hostile security architecture. And Israel's security doctrine has essentially begun treating Turkey the way it once treated Iran, as a strategic threat to be managed, contained, and if necessary, preempted. Now, here is the dimension that cuts right to the American interest, because if you are sitting in the United States watching all of this unfold, you should be asking a very simple question. Whose side is Washington on in this collision? And the uncomfortable answer is that Washington is caught between two impossible positions simultaneously. Turkey remains a NATO member, yet its actions increasingly diverge from alliance interests, deepening ties to Hamas, tolerating anti-Israel networks on Turkish soil, and signaling a willingness to escalate militarily in ways that complicate US efforts to manage an already volatile Middle East. Yet Washington cannot simply abandon Turkey. The geography will not allow it. The American nuclear weapons stored at Incirlik Air Base function as a concrete security guarantee, making Turkey an extremely difficult target for any actor, but also making the US fundamentally dependent on Turkish goodwill to maintain that nuclear posture. You cannot threaten to sanction the country that is sitting on your nuclear arsenal. That is the trap Washington built for itself, and it has no clean exit. Without US involvement, the Israel-Turkey rivalry would remain a regional competition. With US alignment shifts, the rivalry becomes structured. Israel now operates within a network that includes US military backing, while Turkey feels partially excluded from that same system, making Ankara more assertive in Syria and the Mediterranean, and Israel less cautious in countering Turkish moves. This is the architecture of accidental war, not a grand design leading to deliberate conflict, but a system of competing incentives, wounded pride, religious civilizational ambition, and real military capability that produces escalation through miscalculation. That is actually the more dangerous scenario. Grand designs can be negotiated. Miscalculations cannot be recalled once they are airborne. And airborne is precisely where this story is heading. Turkey's Khan fighter jets will be conducting intensive flight testing throughout 2026. With multiple prototypes slated for testing through 2026 and production aircraft expected by 2028 to 2029, Khan is progressing steadily toward operational status, with interest already emerging from Spain, Indonesia, and Gulf states as an alternative to Western platforms. Turkey's Bayraktar drones are already battle-proven on multiple continents. Turkish air defense systems intercepted live ballistic missiles just weeks ago. Turkey commands NATO's airborne forces, and yet Turkey is simultaneously being frozen out of the F-35 program by a combination of American political caution and Israeli technical leverage, pushing Ankara deeper into the arms of strategic autonomy and perhaps deeper into the arms of alternative partners that Washington would rather not see armed. For Erdogan, confrontation with Israel brings not just risks but political dividends. It positions Turkey not as a peripheral member of the Western world, but as an autonomous center of power, combining military capability, historical memory, and civilizational ambition. That is the key to understanding everything happening right now. This is not just about fighter jets and air bases and missile interceptions. It is about who writes the rules of the new Middle East, who gets to claim moral leadership in the Muslim world, and whether the post-World War II Western security architecture, built on interlocking alliances, shared values, and collective defense, can survive a world in which its own members are arming against each other. Turkey's air force is not just a military capability, it is a political statement made of steel and jet fuel delivered at supersonic speed, directly at the foundations of an order that the United States built and can no longer fully control. That is the story. That is why Turkey's skies matter to everyone from Washington to Tel Aviv, to Brussels to Beijing, because the next chapter of global power is not going to be written in a boardroom or a diplomatic cable. It is going to be written 30,000 feet above the Eastern Mediterranean, where the rules are still being decided, and where no one, not even the most powerful nation on earth, can guarantee what comes next.